Thank you very much, Peter. It's always a pleasure to be at these advanced Austrian seminars at FEE. And I've been giving this talk on the history of Austrian economics for so many years that the history has changed. I put a timeline here that will indicate, see, this important year 1954 is unimportant for everybody else. It's important for me because that's when I first began to be a student of Ludwig von Mises. So the Austrian school began in 1871, 140 years ago approximately. Okay, I came in contact with it in 1954, not too much after the middle of this span, but till the 140 years till today. So that sure, the Austrian school has changed. The history of the Austrian school has changed. It's a different story than it was when I came in 1954. Okay, having indicated that, I can erase this because this is not important. Okay, but just to give you my perspective on things, we're going to talk about these different periods as I divide them. The first period between 1870 and basically World War I. Following World War I, the period till the early 30s. Then from about the mid-30s on to the early 70s. And then the modern period since the early 1970s. This was the initial period. This was the founding period. This could be called a consolidation period. This was a period of decline and revival. Decline and dramatic revival. This is the most exciting period for me. In most stories, this would be the part that would be left out, because that's the least illustrious period. But I see this, as I'll explain, I see this as the most remarkable period in the history of the Austrian school. And then since the early 70s, we've had the Austrian resurgence that is responsible for your being here today. When we talk about the Austrian School of Economic Theory, we're talking about the economic theory as an affirmation or denial of the existence of systematic chains of cause and effect in economic affairs. Economic theory has debated that issue. Is there or is there not a special kind of causation, the economic causation, chains of cause and effect that are not physical, not psychological, but something that we can call economic? The Austrian school certainly answers that question affirmatively. Yes, indeed, there are chains of economic cause and effect, and the history of the Austrian school is a history of how that affirmation has expressed itself in different times during this 140-year period. Let's not forget that there was a background. The world didn't begin in 1871. 1871 was the time when Karl Menger published his Grundsätze, what became the Principles of Economics in its English version. That was 1871. Before that, the dominant school in economics, both in the United Kingdom and on the continent, was the classical school. Classical school of economics, and it was in the 1870s that the classical school was gradually replaced by the neoclassical revolution, as it's sometimes called. Neoclassical revolution. And the Austrian school, as it developed in the 1870s, has often been seen as an element in the neoclassical revolution, and that's correct. it was an important element in the neoclassical revolution. Let me give you, however, a slightly different take on what this meant. I'm going to put a little diagram on the board. That is very simplified, but I think is useful in conveying a certain point. I'm going to start out by having resources at the top, consumers down here. The economic process is a process of translating resources into goods that satisfy consumer preferences and desires. That's the basic meaning of an economic system. It's the social system through which resources become more or less efficiently transformed into goods and services that consumers need, desire, and wish to have. Okay. Now, in a market system, there are business firms which mediate between the nature-given resources and the needs and preferences of consumers. These business firms are the producers. Okay, these are the producers. And this is basically the whole system. Now, the system is very complicated. Many different kinds of resources, many different levels of resources, and many different levels of production. Okay, but you can telescope it all into this highly simplified schematic picture of the economic process. In this process, there are markets. In a market system, there are markets for resources, markets for intermediate resources, markets for produced resources, and there are markets for all kinds of consumers' goods. And there are therefore prices. There are market prices. And there are millions of decisions being made in this system. What resources to buy, what resources to use, what methods of production to use, what consumer goods to produce. All of these decisions are being made. Consumers are making decisions, business firm producers are making decisions, resource owners are making decisions, at all of the levels that you can imagine here. Millions of decisions being made. But basically, this is what's happening. There are producers who are translating resources into consumer goods, and this generates, the interaction between all of this generates sets of decisions and sets of exchanges and sets of prices, market prices. Now, from a physical point of view, there's no question as to what the direction of causation is. If you see ice cream down here, you can imagine a process of production that started with resources and finishes up with ice cream. If you see a car being used on the highway for recreational purposes, then you can talk about the metal resources, the engineering resources, the manufacturing resources that went into the production of all the stages of production that finished up in the form of the car that's being used for consumer purposes. Of course, along the road, many other vehicles are being produced. Trucks that bring cars from Detroit to New York. All different kinds of goods being produced, but these are on the way to the final. The final is what the consumer buys. That's the end of the story. It's very important to know there's a beginning and there's an end. There's an end to the story. When you've eaten that ice cream, that's the end of it. Right? The economic process is when you've bought that car and you're driving it, that's the end of the process. I emphasize this because in principles texts, there's very often a discussion of a circular flow. The circular flow idea has certain advantages to it. It focuses our attention on certain aspects that are useful and valuable, but it misleads. The circular flow gives you the impression that there's an economic process that has no beginning and has no end. And what I'm trying to emphasize here is, yes, there's a beginning and there's an end. There are raw resources from which you start at any given time, and that leads up to the satisfaction of consumer preferences, and that's the end of it. Now, the direction of causation physically is certainly from the top to the bottom. Karl Menger, glimpsed a revolutionary perspective. You see, the classical economists took that direction and they said, well, look, everybody sees that the bread we eat is produced by land and labor digging the soil, plowing the soil, planting the soil, cutting the crop, bring it to the mill, grinding it, baking the bread, right? And so that the bread eaten by the consumer, it can be shown to come from the earlier levels of resources. And therefore they reasoned, very reasonably, that sure, the direction of economic causation is similarly from top to bottom. This came to be called the cost of production theory of value. Value, market prices, are determined by the past. The bread that you eat, right, the bread down here has a history. It's that history that determines its value. The history, the cost of production, the physical conditions of production determine what's produced down here. They determine the value of what's produced, and this is the whole system. The classical view was a system which saw the direction of economic causation as being from top to bottom. Notice they had no reservations about the meaningfulness of economic causation. The classical economists were economists. They believed, they understood, yes, there are chains of economic cause and effect, but the direction of that causation was from top to bottom. Menger saw, he glimpsed it. He glimpsed it. He glimpsed a perspective on the economic process which saw things exactly the other way around. The direction of economic causation is from bottom to the top. Now that's a revolutionary concept. It's not merely a demand theory of value, a marginal utility theory of value, as opposed to a cost of production theory of value. It's not merely that, it's much more than that. It's a recognition that the process that is being described here is a process that starts from, is caused by consumer preferences. Consumers need bread. Consumers want bread. Consumers want ice cream. Consumers want bathing suits. Consumers want cars to drive from one place to another. Not for business. They want it to enjoy. Those are consumers. If you want a car for business, that's somewhere in the middle here. But consumers want cars they want to enjoy the drive, okay? Because they want these things, this sets up a stream of causation which generates production. The only reason why bread is being produced is because the consumers are standing in line for bread. Bread is not being produced because there are wheat fields that can produce bread. Bread is not being produced because there are bakers who stand ready to bake, because there are mills that stand ready to grind flour. The bread is produced because consumers want bread. It's because consumers want bread that bakers feel it's worthwhile for them to bake bread, that millers will feel that it's worthwhile for them to grind the wheat into flour, and so on. The causation all goes from down, way up, all the way up. Now, this, as I say, was what Menger glimpsed. And the beginning of the Austrian school, what we call period A, the founding period, was based on one particular application of this perspective, this revolutionary perspective. I'm emphasizing this was only one particular application, because the rest of the perspective that Menger glimpsed sort of disappeared for a while. Menger saw it, but it's as if, you're in the night, a stormy night, and the flash of lightning strikes you, and you see everything. Then the lightning disappears, and you forget what you saw, except one thing you remember. That's the sort of picture I believe one should get from what happened in the founding Austrian period. Menger had this glimpse of the causation process, exactly the opposite of what had been dominant before, and this led him to, and this generated his book, the principles of economics, as it's translated, the Grundsätze, Nationalökonomie. This was a revolutionary book. Hayek has described Menger as saying that when he wrote this book, he wrote it in a fever of excitement, because he saw that he was turning things upside down. And but the sort of the tragedy in a way was that although he glimpsed this, the content of Austrian economics in its founding period was only a limited manifestation of this vision which he had. The particular part of this vision that was articulated and came to become the main body of Austrian economics in its first 40 years or so was the subjective theory of value. The subjective theory of value, the marginal utility theory of value, in which it came to be realized that values, prices, market prices are determined not by cost but by utility. That part of it was well understood, was well articulated. That became the central doctrine of the Austrian school. Notice that this was somewhat different from other neoclassical schools. Other neoclassical schools, particularly Marshall, the revolutionary character of the marginal utility revolution was somehow masked in Marshallian economics. Alfred Marshall, the great British economist, he was trying to preserve some of the basic classical economic insights. What he was trying to do was to enrich the classical insights by recognition of the demand side of the market, the marginal utility side. But he still believed that the cost side had an equally important role to play. So that's why we in today's economics, what we teach freshmen, we still talk about the supply and demand curve as if these were independent sources of causation for market values. You've got a demand side representing marginal utility, you've got a supply side representing cost of production, and it's the interplay of the objective and the subjective, the interplay of cost and utility, the interplay of supply and demand that generates market price. That was the Marshallian perspective. It came to dominate what the broader neoclassical schools, and is still very much in the center of modern microeconomics. The Austrians, all the way from the beginning, recognized that this was a superficial way of understanding the determination of value. Value was determined purely by the demand side. The supply side, the conditions of supply were passive background. For the Austrians, they were just passive background. The difference is a philosophical difference. It's a profound philosophical difference, but it's a philosophical difference. Nobody's saying that Marshallian economics will predict a different market value than an Austrian theory would. The point is, what is the nature of causation? What causes the emergence of market values? For the classical economists, it was costs only. For Marshall, it was the interplay of costs and utility. For the Austrians, it was utility only. What about supply? Isn't there such a thing as supply? Isn't there a law of supply and demand? Well, the Austrians saw very profoundly, very subtly, that supply is also an expression of demand. If you have to hire workers to produce your ice cream, what wages do you have to pay them? You have to pay them wages that are sufficiently high to make it attractive to them not to work in the bakery industry, right? So that indirectly, the costs you confront in the ice cream industry are nothing but an expression of the utility to consumers of the bread that these people could have been baking. This is the alternative cost doctrine. Okay, and that's a profound idea. It shows that both the supply curve and the demand curve are ultimately demand. Ultimately demand. In a particular industry, you can talk about supply, you can talk about the cost of production determining supply, but those costs of production are nothing else but the disguised manifestation of the utility of which these resources might have been able to produce in alternative industries. So that what is it that determines value here? It's the consumer's utility in all its manifestations, for ice cream, for bread, for everything. All of those preferences are in the mix, and they determine the prices that will have to be paid for resources, and this determines what resources it will be useful and prudent to bring into production. Whether a person gets up from sleeping to get to work depends on what is offered. And that depends on the urgency with which consumers want different goods. Okay? Whether they will get up to drive to a bakery industry or will get up to drive to an ice cream industry will depend on the different wages that is being offered. Everything depends on the consumers. This was the central truth that dominated the first period, the founding period. It was an important truth. I sometimes call it Menger's law. Menger's law was that the value of anything is determined by its value to consumers. The market price of anything is ultimately determined by its value to consumers. I sometimes talk about a treasure box, okay? Okay? This is the treasure box. In that box there's $1 billion. I used to say $1 million. In that box there's $1 billion in gold. Okay? That box is locked with an impregnable lock for which there's a key. And this is the key. Right? That's the key. Right? That's the key to the $1 billion. How much is that key worth? Well, the answer is it's as close to $1 billion as you can imagine. The value of the key, because the key unlocks $1 billion. If you can only get to the $1 billion by having the key, how much will you bid for the key? You bid $100? Sure. With $100 you can get $1 billion. If somebody bids 1,000, will you bid 2? Sure. If somebody bids 1 million, will you bid 2? Why not? Right? And so on. And the competition between consumers will bid up the price until it's as close to $1 billion as you can imagine. What about the cost of production of the key? Irrelevant. Irrelevant. The value of the key is determined by the value of that which can unlock. Resources unlock ice cream. Resources unlock bread. Resources unlock bicycles and cars. The resources, the value of the resources is determined by the value of the goods that these resources can produce, not the other way around. That was the basic message of the early Austrians. So but what Menger glimpsed, as I say, he glimpsed it. He glimpsed more than this theory of value. He glimpsed that the whole course of causation, the entire structure of chains of cause and effect were and are determined from bottom up. That's a broader wider perspective. And we shall see that the history of Austrian economics consists of the way in which that vision was lost, was ignored, and finally came to be rediscovered. I had 4 periods on the blackboard. Or was it 5? I don't remember. 4, I guess. The original period was till about World War I. That was the founding period. That's when you had Karl Menger with his book, his younger disciples, Eugene von Böhm-Bawerk, Friedrich von Wieser. Right? These were not strictly students of his, but they were younger scholars deeply influenced by him. And together in the 1880s and 1890s, they developed a institutional school of thought. You have to understand that that school of thought was very unpopular at the time. On the continent, the Austrian school was dismissed by the German historical school. They were totally dismissed. Gustav Schmoller of the German school, he wrote totally with disdain about these Austrians. There was a bitter Methodenstreit, which is not the time to go into that. A bitter fight, bitter doctrinal fight between the Austrians and the Germans. The German school was pretty much dominant on the continent. The British school, as I pointed out, was somewhere in between. The Marshallians were somewhere in between the classicals and the Austrians. The German historical school was basically denying that there are systematic chains of economic causation. They would say there are specific matters of causation depending on the particularities, the historical particularities of a particular time and a particular place. But there are no broad, theoretical, powerful laws that economic theory, of course, insists do exist. So there was a extremely bitter controversy between the Austrians and not only the British school, not only, of course, the residue of the classical school, but in particular the German historical school. This was up until World War I. By World War I, Menger had retired early, I think it was 1903. Böhm-Bawerk died in 1914. Wieser still continued to teach in Vienna after World War I till his death in 1926. So he was still very active in the immediate post-World War I period. When I was once in the early 80s in Vienna, I was there on 2 occasions. One of them, I found I made a very unpopular statement. I said I'm the only Austrian in this room. But what I discovered at that time was that many of the economists there were deeply influenced by students of Wieser, so that they saw Austrian economics as being represented by Wieser rather than by Böhm-Bawerk or even Menger. So there was a lot going on in the interwar period. There was Wieser was still teaching. Hans Meyer, who was his prime student, took over his chair after Wieser's death, and so he perpetuated the influence of Wieser. I won't try and articulate the specific differences between Wieser, say, and Böhm-Bawerk, but this period between 1918, the end of World War I, until the early 30s, I describe it as the consolidation period. It was a period in which Austrian economics enjoyed its highest reputation. It was, in fact, closest to the neoclassical mainstream at that time. That was a period, especially the 1920s. That was the period, the the most prosperous period for Austrian economics in terms of its academic reputation in the profession. If you were an American graduate student, you'd want to, and you're making a tour of the European universities, you want to stop off at Vienna, try and sit in at a seminar. If you were a young faculty member, you'd be honored if you were invited to present a paper at an Austrian seminar in the University of Vienna. Okay, it was the most successful period of the Austrian school, and as I say, it was a period in which Austrian economics came to be seen as a particular form of neoclassical economics. There was a neoclassical revolution, there were different schools of thought, and the Austrians were a very important member of that group of schools of like-minded economists. Even Ludwig von Mises in 1932 endorsed that perspective that Austrian economics and other schools of theoretical economics were basically saying the same message, except they were using different forms of exposition. More mathematics, less mathematics, this language, that language, this style, that style, but basically the same idea. What he meant by that was that all of the schools had rejected the German historical school. They were all accepting the basic idea that, yes, economic theory is a valid body of doctrine that explains the reality of the existence of chains of cause and effect. That was indeed the reason why and the explanation for the Misesian endorsement of this idea that all the schools of economic thought were basically saying the same thing. They were basically saying the same thing, and that, yes, there were economic chains of cause and effect. Let me as a footnote here, let me explain why it's so important to affirm the existence of chains of economic cause and effect. Since the beginning of economics, you can mark the beginning of economics whatever you want. Since the beginning of economics, the great issue has been government interference in the market system. That's been the basic issue. The view which supports the need for and the duty of governments to intervene in economic systems is a simple one. You've got a ball of putty, the economic system, and you want to shape it in a certain direction. You are the government. You have the power to do so. It's your duty to do so. That's the basic perception of the need for and justification for government intervention. What economists from the very beginning taught, and this was revolutionary, was not so fast. This ball of putty is not a ball of putty at all. It's a structure which has its own laws, and you'd better pay attention to those laws. If you're on the 6th floor of a building and it's stuffy and the window is open, so you want to take a walk out of the window to get some fresh air, I would advise you take note of the law of gravity. It's quite true that the window is open, the air is fresher out there, and it might seem the simple matter to take the step out there. But there are consequences. The putty idea fails to recognize the existence of these chains of cause and effect. It fails to recognize the notion of economic law. Maybe not as powerful, not as immediate as the law of gravity, but nonetheless as important or more important. Okay? There are chains of cause and effect. If you do something, these may have effects which you hadn't recognized. You'd better pay attention to that. That's the basic reason why economics has to choose. Do you accept the notion that there are these laws of causation, these chains of cause and effect, which have to be respected, like the law of gravity, or not. So you have to understand that the German school, which was basically a rejection of economic theory, was a school of thought which was teaching the ability of the government and the duty of the government to modify, to limit, to regulate the economic system. And the economists, all the schools of thought, this is what Mises in 1932 was saying. Yes, all the schools of thought are united in recognizing that's wrong. There are chains of cause and effect, which you better understand, you better recognize them, better respect them. So this was, as I say, the most successful period of in the history of the Austrian school. During the 1930s, there was a remarkable doctrinal change. That doctrinal change was that the Austrian school, from being up there in academic reputability, shot all the way down. That happened during the 1930s. There will be many doctoral dissertations devoted to understanding the events that formed that decline. What is it? What was it? There was a Hayek-Keynes debate going on in the early 30s. There was a socialist economic calculation debate going on at the same time. There was a flourishing of new mathematical methods in economics. There was a flourishing of applied economics, econometrics in economics. All of that tended to push the Austrians to the margin. There was a capital theory controversy between the Austrians and Frank Knight. Frank Knight, the great Chicago economist, whose reputation was enormously impressive, and he dismissed the Austrian capital theory, particularly Hayek, completely out of the picture. And remember, Hayekian capital theory was at the root of his theory of business cycles, so that you had all of these doctrinal battles going on, and the end result of all of these was that by the end of the 30s, the Austrian school was down in the pits. This is why when I marked period C, the period between the early 30s and the late 40s, I marked those, I circled that, and I said this is probably the period that most histories of Austrian economics would like to forget, because it was the period not just of decline, but it was the period of total dismissal. Austrian school was in the dustbin of doctrinal history, so to speak. And when I mentioned 1954, the year that I came into contact with the Austrian school, at that point in time, it had not been recognized that we were no longer in that period. At that 1954, the story that I was given when I told people I was studying under Mises, you're studying under Mises? Mises hasn't had an idea in 20 years. The Austrian school is dead. You're embarking on the wrong school of thought. That's old-fashioned and dead. The history of economic thought textbooks that I studied in the 1950s had a respectful chapter on the Austrians up until World War I, and that was it. And then was the footnote somewhere that Mises and Hayek are still alive. Something to that effect. So these were the last vestiges of a dead school. Dead, buried, maybe, but dead. Okay, this was the picture when I came into 1954. But I believe this picture of the Austrian school was a total misreading of history. total misreading of history. In fact, during those years, the years between the early 30s and, say, 1950, those years were years of remarkable, revolutionary innovations in Austrian theory. Mises and Hayek, both in 1948-49, okay, the different publication dates of Hayek's 1948-49 book, those books, Hayek's book of 1948-49 and Mises' Human Action, those books constituted a revolutionary change in Austrian economics. What happened? What happened? Why didn't anybody notice? Well, we mentioned that one of the elements in the history of the 1930s was the debate on Austrian economic calculation. Very briefly, back in 1922, Mises in Vienna had written a book. He had first written a journal article, followed a year or two later by a book in which he maintained that central economic planning, socialist economic planning, was impossible. Impossible. It's not something that, it's not that it's not going to be successful. It's not that it's going to be an economic disaster. It just cannot be done, period. The possibility of central economic planning is a myth. And the reason why he said that was because planning requires that you know what you're talking about. Planning requires that you know what your resources are. Planning requires that you know the alternative uses that the resources have in different types of utilization. So should you plan your day? Should you go to A first and B later? Should B first or B later? Maybe not go to B, go to C. You've got your day. You've got so many hours of the day. You've got the different uses to which you can dispose your time. You've got your valuation of the uses of these time. Therefore, you can make comparisons. What's more important for you? Is this a waste of your time? Or is this a valuable use of your time? You know what the alternative uses of the time are. In the case of planning with resources, it would be necessary for any central planning authority to know the alternative usefulness of resources in different uses. There is no way they can know that, unless it's an extremely small sort of household type plan, which is centrally planned. Unless it's that kind of a scenario, anything a little bit more complicated is just impossible. What permits a business firm to plan is the fact that the business firm is able to utilize market prices for resources. But in a socialist economy, in a centrally planned economy, by definition, there are no resource markets. If there are no resource markets, because there's no private ownership of resources, therefore there are no resource markets. If there are no resource markets, there are no market prices for resources. If there are no market prices for resources, there can be no planning, because you don't know the value of resources and alternative uses. No way in which you can plan. It's not that the planners may not be motivated to plan effectively. See, the Buchanan, the public choice school, have argued that planning can't work because public officials are motivated by their private benefits and costs rather than by social benefits and costs. That may be true, but that's not the point. The point is that there is no way in which you can plan centrally. I sometimes put it this way: if you see on the floor what looks like a gold ring, and you ask somebody, pick it up for me, please. He may be motivated to pick it up for you and may not, right? So you can talk about motivation. But supposing what you thought was a ring was really a series of gold beads placed in a circular pattern, and you ask somebody to please pick up that ring, it's impossible, because there's no ring. There is, in a socialist society, there is no knowledge of the elements necessary to plan. There can be no plan. This is not a lecture on socialist calculation, so I won't go into any further. Anyway, this was Mises' position in the early 20s, and that generated a vigorous debate in the late 20s in the German language, and in the 1930s mainly in the English language. And particularly in 1936, there were papers by Oskar Lange and Aber Lerner which seemed to use up-to-date, sophisticated microeconomic theory to explain how planning could indeed take place in a socialist economy. There could be quasi-market prices. Okay? There could be prices promulgated by socialist authority, which wouldn't be market prices, but they would be indicators of social value that would be modified by trial and error, and so that at any given time it was maintained, there could be central planning, which could be updated and modified as in the trial and error process. Now, without getting into the nitty-gritty of that debate, what I'm trying to explain is that debate taught Mises and Hayek that Mises' statement in 1932 that there is no difference, no fundamental difference between different schools of thought was dead wrong. It was dead wrong. I can assure you that when I came in 1954 to study under Mises, there was no doubt in Mises' mind that the mainstream of economics, not just its macroeconomic version, not just its Keynesian version, but the basic microeconomic price theory of the economic profession was utterly different than the economic theory, market theory, price theory that Mises himself believed to be the truth. There's no question about that. What happened? What happened was, in my opinion, that the socialist economic calculation debate convinced Mises and convinced Hayek that they were pursuing, the Austrians, Mises and Hayek, were pursuing a vision which had been missed by the mainstream schools of thought, by the British neoclassical school of thought, what became basically the dominant macroeconomic theory of the mid-20th century. They believed that, and they set out to articulate what it was that set their economics apart. Hayek, in a remarkable series of papers on knowledge, in the late 30s and early 40s, in a remarkable series of papers, developed his idea that the economic system is a system of dissemination of information. The price system is a system of communication. It's a system by which information possessed in one part of the economic system is transmitted effectively and economically to potential decision makers elsewhere in the system. This is how Hayek articulated his understanding of the economic system. And this was a series of, a remarkable series of papers in which this view was put forward. It was a view which I think Hayek was articulating tentatively. He was feeling his way to articulating in this way. One of those papers was the paper in which he talked about the meaning of competition. And what boiled down from these papers is that the major difference between the mainstream neoclassical school and the Mises-Hayek school was the focus on equilibrium in the mainstream. The mainstream was treating price theory as equilibrium price theory. That's all it was, nothing more. Equilibrium price theory. And it was Hayek in his articulation, in his expositions, that developed the idea that the market system is a system through which knowledge is communicated and changed. Equilibrium starts out with the assumption that everything that needs to be known is already known. The Hayekian market process theory understands that the process is a process of knowledge communication. This was Hayek. Competition was not the perfect competition of Frank Knight. It was Frank Knight who articulated the, the elements of competition, perfect competition, that the textbooks have picked up on. We'll talk about this more this afternoon. The perfect knowledge assumption, the uniform price assumption, the homogeneous commodity assumption, all of those assumptions, the insignificance of any one participant, all of those assumptions are assumptions that Knight put into the picture in order to achieve an equilibrium picture of perfect competition. Hayek pointed out that the real world competition, the competition upon which the market process depends, is dynamic, meaning it's competition that takes place before you've reached equilibrium. That's that was the Hayekian revolution. The Misesian revolution, these are not identical. Hayek's articulation was different than Mises. But they both basically, coming from somewhat different directions, they both basically had the same idea as to what it is that makes up the market process. Mises' idea was the entrepreneurial idea. That's why he called his book Human Action. Human action is different than constrained maximization. We'll talk more about this afternoon. Constrained maximization is the unit of analysis in standard microeconomics. The microeconomist assumes that the market is made up of decision makers, each of which has a perfect view of what the state of affairs is, and must, within those constraints, must try and squeeze out the greatest volume of utility he can get for himself, greatest volume of monetary profit he can get for himself, given those constraints. Constrained maximization. Hayek's notion of the human action, which he didn't call his book Human Action by accident. He called his book Human Action because he believed that the difference between human action and the standard decision-making is crucial. That difference is the entrepreneurial element in human action. When human beings act, they are not merely choosing from a given set of options that are laid in front of them. They are identifying what those options are. That's the human action. And that entrepreneurial element is what is completely missing in the mainstream view. So what happened in that period between the early 1930s and 1950 was a remarkable change in the basic content of Austrian economics. Now, if history would have stopped there, okay, that would have meant that the history of the Austrian school was basically a development of a subjectivist perspective on value, basically a consolidation of that view basically in line with the mainstream neoclassical schools, except that at the end of the period, just before they were buried, the Austrians seemed to articulate some new ideas. But what happened was that history didn't stop there. History did not stop in that period C, with period of decline and revolutionary revival. What happened was that those books by Hayek and Mises they took a life of their own, and they did generate interest first by a small number of students, and subsequently by a larger and larger number of students. Younger scholars began to discover these new ideas in the Austrian school, and the Austrian school since then has enjoyed a remarkable resurgence. As you know, in the early 1970s there was a meeting, a historic meeting in South Royalton. So South Royalton meeting was one in which Murray Rothbard, Ludwig Lachmann, and myself were the lecturers. It was a small group, relatively small group of scholars there. And I can tell you, it's looking back, it seems remarkable. I was at a meeting planning that South Royalton meeting, and there was a discussion what to call it. Should it be identified as Austrian? In other words, the foundations that were funding that particular meeting were not at all sold that the Austrian label was a useful label to use. After all, the Austrian label was in the dirt. Why call a conference Austrian if that's not necessarily what you want to do and what you want to project? Eventually, for whatever reasons, the word Austrian was retained, and I believe it was from that meeting that gradually the word Austrian came to be identified with a growing revival of the older Austrian ideas as articulated, as enriched by Mises and by Hayek. This was a new perspective on the meaning of economics, the nature of economic causation. There have been lots of ups and downs since then. The three lecturers, the Rothbard, Lachmann, Kirzner lecturers at South Royalton were loggerheads in many respects. Ludwig Lachmann and myself, we had a long correspondence over perhaps 30 years, in which it took me about 20 years to realize that Lachmann and I were on a different wavelength. I had a deep respect for Lachmann. I still do. He was a dear colleague, but and he was a courageous thinker at the time when to identify with Mises was professional suicide. He stood up and he identified himself with Mises, but he wrote an article from Mises to Shackle, which made it very clear that for him Mises was not the end. Mises was simply a way station to a Shackleian, the great British economist George Shackle, who had a vision of economics which was totally different than the Austrians. In fact, by some curious back road, it seemed to lead to the opposite view, that there's no such thing as economic causation. Things get complicated. And Lachmann believed that a consistent pursuit of Misesian insights would lead one ineluctably towards Shackle. I never accepted that. I believe that the Misesian view was an absolutely sound view. Everything that I myself have written on the economic process over the past 50, 60 years has been, in my view, an articulation of what Mises really meant, and to try and demonstrate the truth and the significance and the importance of those teachings. So I won't go into some of the nitty-gritty institutional details of the revival. There have been many younger scholars who have contributed. I've got a list: Rothbard, Rizzo, O'Driscoll, Garrison, Salerno, David Harper, Steve Horowitz, Pete Betke, Richard Ebeling, Larry White, George Selgin, and others have all, and Sandy Akita right here, who have all made important contributions to the revival of Austrian economics. I'm sure that during this week you'll be encountering more names and insights into the way in which these younger scholars have developed the Hayek-Misesian insights into economics. So I'll try and give some of my own ideas on these matters in my lecture this afternoon. Why don't I stop right here? Thank you. I'll be very happy to take questions. Yes, sir.
I was told that Lachmann, William Hutt, I think that you yourself were working in South Africa. What happened in South Africa that it seems like there was something there, I don't know if exactly Austrian.
Okay, I had nothing to do with it. I left South Africa at the age of 18. I had nothing to do with economics at that time. My sister had been a student of Hutt's, Bill Hutt's at the University of Cape Town. She received her degree, Bachelor of Commerce degree, I think it was called at that time, at the University of Cape Town under Hutt. But I don't believe she was exposed to any Austrian ideas. Hutt was not an Austrian. Hutt was a British London School economist. The London School before Robbins and before Hayek. He studied under Cannon, I believe, and Arnold Plant. So that was Hutt. Hutt was a great scholar. He wrote wonderful books, but he was not an Austrian. Lachmann had nothing to do with Hutt, as far as I know. Lachmann was in Johannesburg, and Hutt was in Cape Town. And although there was only 1,000 miles between them, it was like you were on a different continent. So although it sounds as if there's a sort of must be a connection, the South African school, that I don't believe that those three names have any connection with each other. Okay? Yes?
You explained how you came to diverge with Rothbard. What about Rothbard?
How I came to diverge from Rothbard? Okay, I guess it's a longer story that I haven't really explored that story, to be quite honest. Rothbard was a genius. He directed his genius, I believe, to ideological, to logical courses for which he believed Austrian economics was important. Okay, I don't believe that Rothbardian economics represents the best interpretation of Mises. On a number of issues, I disagreed with Rothbard explicitly. On others, I just don't believe that he got to the heart of what Mises want. There are a number of issues where there were specific differences. Rothbard followed Salerno in claiming that there was a sharp gulf separating Mises and Hayek. I think that was a tragic mistake. There's a disagreement on that, and no doubt people will write doctoral dissertations on that issue too. I think it's a mistake, a tragic mistake for Austrian economics to try and drive a wedge between Hayek and Mises. I'm not claiming that Mises and Hayek saw eye to eye on everything, fundamental philosophical issues. They did not. They certainly did not. But in one respect, and this is the only important respect, is the fact that they both understood the market as a process of knowledge discovery. Both of them agreed with that. Hayek in 1968 wrote a paper, I believe, entitled "A Competition as a Discovery Procedure." I believe that was the title of the paper, in which I find very little separating him from the Misesian view. I had the privilege of giving a lecture in Freiburg when Hayek was in the audience, and he was kind enough afterwards to get up and make some remarks, and his remarks was to the effect that, well, my work has expressed the idea in knowledge, in terms of knowledge. Kirzner prefers to interpret the same set of features of the economic system in terms of entrepreneurship, and that's fine. That was basically his, and I believe that he was fundamentally in agreement with Mises on that. Okay, there are other disagreements on monopoly theory that I had with Rothbard. I don't want to anyway detract from Rothbard's genius and his intellectual courage in endorsing what he understood to be Austrian economics at a time when it was very unpopular. In 1962, when he published his Man, Economy and State, that was a courageous act to do. But I can't agree with his interpretation of Mises. Yes, sir.
What is the role of Schumpeter in the Austrian economy story?
Schumpeter, of course, was a student of Böhm-Bawerk. He was trained in Vienna. He was, to that extent, more Austrian than anybody else. right? He and Mises were in the same seminar, in the Bambergerkian seminar before World War I. Having said that, there is very little in Schumpeter's work that would put him on the same wavelength as Hayek and Mises. It's true that Schumpeter understood the entrepreneur. His view of the entrepreneur is not mine. Okay, there's a difference between my idea of the entrepreneur and Schumpeter's, but to the extent that Schumpeter did focus on the entrepreneur, to that extent he did not belong in the mainstream of 20th century microeconomics. Okay, otherwise there's nothing beyond that could possibly might possibly identify him as Austrian in the doctrinal sense.
With the big revival of entrepreneurship research and entrepreneurship theory, and especially management and business studies now, you have gotten a big mainstream following, but those people tend to ignore the fact that you're Austrian, and they tend to ignore free market policy sides and all these implications, or simply place that they're ignorant of your views on these things. What do you think of your work being used in that concept?
Okay, I haven't read all of that work, so I hear from time to time people tell me basically what you're telling me. And to some extent, I say, well, that's great if people have discovered the meaning of entrepreneurship. I'll be talking this afternoon, to some extent, more on that. My view of, the focus in managerial theory is how do you be a good entrepreneur? Okay, you've got these bright young college grads who want to become millionaires. Billionaires, okay? Okay? They want to become billionaires by becoming entrepreneurs. They've heard that entrepreneurship is somehow associated with becoming billionaires. So how do you train people to be entrepreneurs? Now, as it happens, I subscribe to a statement by Will Baumol that if you can teach it, it's not entrepreneurship. So I don't believe you can teach people to be entrepreneurs. That happens to be my position. But if this focuses attention on entrepreneurship, which I believe to be crucially important for the economic system, I don't know how to be an entrepreneur. Otherwise, it wouldn't be here, right? I don't know how to be, what makes a good entrepreneur. But I do know what entrepreneurship does for the market process. That's the focus of my work, which I understand to be what Mises had in mind, okay? So that's my response to this question. Yes?
What do you make of Peter Klein's recent contention that Mises' view of the entrepreneur should be more closely linked to...
Should be what?
Should be linked to Frank Knight's view of capitalist or uncertainty-bearing capitalists?
I don't know to what work you're referring, to be quite honest. I'm not completely in touch with everything that's coming out these days. Okay, let me give you my understanding of Knight, and to what extent that is response to your question, I don't know. I'll tell you my understanding of Knight. Knight wrote his book, Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit. Okay, this was his doctoral dissertation in 1921. Okay, in the book, he has the body of the book. Main body of the book is on the theory of the perfectly competitive economy. For Knight, that was simply a preface to the final part of the book, which dealt with uncertainty. See? And uncertainty for Knight meant a world in which the future is unknown and unknowable, not able to be grabbed by frequency probability analysis. Okay? That's uncertainty, Knightian uncertainty, not risk, not insurable risk, uninsurable risk. Knight saw that nothing happens in the economic system unless somebody sticks his neck out. Okay, that's what entrepreneurship means for Knight, sticking one's neck out. You see, if you're hired as a professor, you're not sticking your neck out. You know what your salary is going to be, and that you know what you have to do. That's the deal, right? If you're a bricklayer, you know what you're getting, you know what you have to do. You're not sticking your neck out. But the guy who hires you, okay, he's building a building. Does he know he's going to be able to sell it? Okay, does he know whether the wage he's offering you is the least possible wage he could offer? He's sticking his neck out. Now that's a Knightian view, and I have no quarrel with that so far. The big difference is that Knight's view is that when you stick your neck out, there is no tendency whatsoever to make it more likely than not that you're going to be correct in your action. And I don't believe that that's the truth. That's a big difference between what I think a Knightian view of entrepreneurship is and the Misesian view. The Misesian view is that the existence of error invites more accurate entrepreneurial perception. Knight has no feel for any such tendency. He made the remark that the likelihood is that in any given period, pure entrepreneurial losses are likely to exceed pure entrepreneurial profits. Okay, that's the big difference. So if it's argued that Misesian entrepreneurship should be somehow linked to Knightian entrepreneurship, there are senses in which I would agree with that, but I think the more profound senses are that no, that they're not saying the same thing. The remarkable fact is that Knight students, the Chicago school of the late 20th century, never read the last part of Knight's book. They never read it. I'm convinced they never read it. I'm talking about Stiegler and Friedman. They never read that last part. Impossible. That they could have read it, because their economics is in economics a perfect competition. Perfect competition. Equilibrium always. Knight had a much more sensitive and subtle and profound understanding, except that he's left without any anchor. There's nothing that makes the system sort of systematic, according to him. And I believe that's why their eyes glazed over if they ever looked at the last part of the book. Yes. Could you speak up, please?
Given today's economic climate, I guess it's fair to say that Keynes won the debate between Hughes and Hayek in the 1930s. So what do you think is the main reason for this, and what do you think that Keynes would have said he saw what or how his policies were implemented today?
I don't know. I'm sure you're going to hear lectures this week on the part of scholars who are much better equipped than I am to answer this question. I believe it's simplistic to say that Keynes won the debate. He certainly won the debate in the 1930s. He lost the debate towards the end of the 20th century. You claim that he won the debate today. I'm not sure on what basis you make that statement. You mean by winning the debate, it means that public policies have followed his teachings? Is that?
Just looking at the emphasis of the economic profession today and how economics is taught in
Okay, as I say, I won't necessarily dispute that. I'm not convinced that Keynes is back completely. To some extent, the naive Keynesian. Remember, Keynes was giving a veneer of sophistication to what the untutored man in the street was thinking anyway in the 1930s. Okay, so sure, that untutored, naive man in the street perspective is still alive today. To call that the victory for Keynesian economics is one way of putting it, but I'm not sure that I would. But as I say, it's not my field.
That is all the time we have right now for questions.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Kirzner.
I apologize for that.